The silence hit Marcus first, not the peaceful quiet of a summer evening, but the suffocating absence of sound that made his ears ring. No crickets, no wind through the trees. Even his own breathing seemed muffled as he stood at the edge of what locals called a dead zone. His radio crackled once, then died completely. The GPS on his dashboard flickered between no signal and coordinates that didn't exist on any map. Marcus had been working telecommunications for Apex Communications for 8 years, installing cell towers across rural West Virginia, but he'd never encountered anything like this. The trees here looked wrong. Not dead wrong. Their bark was too dark, almost black, and the leaves hung motionless despite the wind he could feel on his face just 20 feet behind him. The ground beneath them was bare earth, perfectly circular, as if nature itself had drawn a line and said, "Nothing grows here." His supervisor had warned him about the dead zones. "Equipment fails there," Jim had said over coffee that morning. "Locals won't even hunt in those areas anymore. Just get in, install the tower, and get out. Don't linger." Marcus pulled his work gloves tighter and hefted his toolkit. The new cell tower needed to go right in the center of this particular zone, a corporate mandate to improve coverage for the scattered mountain communities. Simple job, in and out. But as he took his first step into that circle of wrongness, something moved in his peripheral vision. When he turned, nothing was there except those 2 dark trees and that unnaturally bare ground. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. Welcome back to another true horror story from the mountains. I'm sharing this because some of you have been asking about my work in telecommunications, and honestly, after what happened to Marcus last month, I need to get this story out there. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, especially if you're in Appalachia. You might recognize some of these places. If this story keeps you up tonight, smash that like button and subscribe for more real encounters from America's forgotten corners. Marcus Chen had moved to West Virginia 3 years ago for the quiet and the steady work. Coming from Baltimore's constant noise and traffic, the rolling mountains and sparse population felt like therapy. Apex Communications paid well for technicians willing to work the rural routes, and Marcus genuinely enjoyed the solitude of his job. Most days involved driving winding mountain roads to isolated homesteads, fixing internet connections for families who lived miles from their nearest neighbor. The work was straightforward: troubleshoot equipment, replace damaged cables, occasionally install new infrastructure. The locals were friendly enough, though many seemed perpetually suspicious of outsiders, especially when those outsiders worked for big companies. Marcus lived in a small apartment above Jenny's Diner in Beckwith, a town of maybe 800 people nestled between 2 ridges. His routine was simple: coffee at Jenny's, check his work orders, drive out to whichever remote location needed service, return by sunset. The mountains had their own rhythm, and Marcus had learned to appreciate it. But there were oddities he'd noticed over the years. Certain areas where his equipment consistently malfunctioned. Patches of forest where his radio went dead and his GPS scrambled. Local repair calls that would be mysteriously canceled when he arrived, with homeowners claiming they'd never made them. The older residents had names for these places: dead zones, quiet spots, bad ground. Marcus had initially dismissed it as mountain superstition. These were often areas with difficult terrain that naturally interfered with signals. But the patterns were too consistent, too precise to be simple geography. Jim Hawthorne, his supervisor and a West Virginia native, was more forthcoming than most. "My granddad worked these mountains for the mining company back in the 50s, Jim had explained one evening. He said there were places where the earth felt thin, like something underneath was pressing up, trying to get through. "What kind of something?" Marcus had asked. Jim had just shrugged. "Nothing good." The dead zones appeared on no official maps, but every local seemed to know exactly where they were. Roughly circular areas, varying in size from a few acres to nearly a square mile, scattered throughout the most remote sections of the mountains. Animals avoided them. Hunters who accidentally wandered in reported feeling watched, experiencing sudden temperature drops and hearing sounds that didn't belong: whispers in the wind, footsteps on bare rock, voices calling their names from empty forest. Marcus had driven past several dead zones during his regular routes, but company policy had always sent other technicians to handle installations in those areas. Until this week. Apex's new rural expansion project required a cell tower installation directly in the center of the largest dead zone in Mingo County. The contract was worth enough that the company was willing to overlook local concerns and equipment difficulties. Marcus was their most experienced rural technician, and the job was his. The work order was straightforward: drive to the specified coordinates, install a standard cellular transmission tower, and ensure all equipment was functioning properly. Expected duration: 1 day. As Marcus loaded his truck that morning, checking his toolkit twice and ensuring his radio batteries were fully charged, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The coordinates on his work order placed the installation site 12 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by an old logging trail that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The logging trail was worse than Marcus had expected. What had once been a proper road was now little more than 2 parallel ruts, carved through dense forest, barely wide enough for his work truck. Branches scraped against his windows as he navigated around fallen trees and washed out sections. His GPS lost signal after the first mile, leaving him to follow handwritten directions Jim had provided. "Follow the trail for 8 miles until you reach the old mining equipment," the notes read. "Turn left at the rusted conveyor belt. Dead zone starts about a quarter mile past that." The mining equipment appeared exactly as described: hulking metal skeletons from the 1960s, slowly being reclaimed by forest. The conveyor belt stretched between 2 hills like the spine of some massive creature, its metal surface stained rust red and green with moss. Marcus turned left as instructed, following an even fainter trail that seemed to wind deeper into the mountains. The change in atmosphere was gradual at first. The forest felt denser despite the trees being spaced normally. Shadows seemed deeper even though the canopy wasn't any thicker. His radio, which had been crackling with static, went completely silent. Then Marcus saw the boundary. It was like someone had drawn a perfect circle with a giant compass. Inside the circle, the forest floor was bare earth, not muddy or rocky, just smooth, dark soil that looked almost artificial. The trees within the boundary were alive, but wrong, their bark darker than it should be, their leaves hanging motionless despite the breeze he could feel on his arms. Marcus parked his truck at the edge and stepped out. The silence was immediate and complete. Not just quiet, absent. His footsteps on gravel seemed to come from somewhere else, muffled and distant. When he called out, "Hello!" experimentally, his voice didn't echo. It simply stopped, as if the air itself was swallowing sound. He pulled out his tablet to double-check the installation coordinates. The screen flickered, showing his location as a pulsing red dot labeled "Error. Coordinates not found." Yet according to his measurements, this was definitely the right spot. Marcus began unloading his equipment: steel tower sections, concrete mix for the foundation power tools, and the cellular transmission hardware. The work itself was routine. He'd installed dozens of similar towers. Dig the foundation hole mix and pour concrete, assemble the tower sections, mount the transmission equipment, run diagnostics. But as he wheeled his first load of gear into the dead zone, something moved in his peripheral vision. Marcus turned sharply, but saw only those unnaturally still trees and bare ground. He waited, scanning the forest carefully. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, like pressure against his skin. He shook it off and began marking the installation site. The work order specified the tower should go in the exact center of the cleared area, which Marcus estimated to be about 40 yards from the tree line. As he paced off the distance, he noticed something odd about the soil. It was warm. Not sun-warmed, actually warm, like heat was rising from below. Marcus knelt and pressed his palm to the ground. The earth felt almost feverish, and when he dug his fingers into the soil, it was noticeably warmer just inches down. The logical explanation was geothermal activity. These mountains had a complex geological history, and underground springs weren't uncommon. But this didn't feel like natural heat. It pulsed almost like a slow heartbeat. Marcus stood and checked his watch. 10:30 a.m. Plenty of time to complete the installation before dark, assuming his equipment cooperated. He returned to his truck for the power auger, a heavy-duty drill for digging the foundation hole. As he bent to lift it from the truck bed, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on bare earth coming from somewhere behind him. Marcus spun around, still gripping the auger. The dead zone stretched empty before him, that same unnaturally smooth soil and motionless trees. But the footsteps continued, not approaching, just walking, circling. "Hello," Marcus called out. His voice was swallowed by the silence again, but the footsteps stopped immediately. The rational part of his mind cataloged possible explanations: an animal he couldn't see settling wood in the forest, his own footsteps somehow echoing with a delay. But every instinct he possessed was screaming that something was actively wrong with this place. Marcus forced himself to focus on the work. He'd come here to install a tower, and that's what he would do. He dragged the auger into the center of the zone and started it up. The machine roared to life, its gas engine abnormally loud after the oppressive silence. Marcus positioned the drill bit and began boring into the warm earth. The soil was softer than expected, almost loose, and the auger chewed through it easily. Too easily. After just 3 minutes of drilling, the auger suddenly lurched downward, nearly pulling Marcus off balance. The bit had broken through into empty space, a void beneath the surface. Marcus shut off the engine and peered into the hole. It was deeper than it should be, maybe 8 feet down and perfectly round. But at the bottom, instead of more soil or rock, there was darkness. Not the darkness of a cave or underground cavity, but absolute consuming blackness that seemed to move. And from that darkness came a sound that had no place in the natural world. A low, rhythmic breathing that wasn't quite breathing, like air being drawn through something that didn't have lungs. Marcus stumbled backward, dropping the auger. The breathing stopped immediately, but now he could hear something else, a scratching sound like fingernails on wood coming from inside the hole. His hands shaking, Marcus grabbed a flashlight from his toolkit and aimed it into the void. The beam seemed to bend and twist as it descended, revealing glimpses of what might have been tunnel walls before disappearing into that impossible darkness. But just before he pulled the light away, Marcus saw something that made his stomach lurch. At the very edge of the flashlight beam, maybe 10 feet down, something pale and elongated was pressed against the tunnel wall. Something that looked disturbingly like a human hand. Marcus backed away from the hole, his mind racing. Underground caverns weren't unusual in this part of West Virginia. The mountains were riddled with old mine shafts and natural caves. But that breathing sound and whatever he'd glimpsed in the darkness felt fundamentally wrong. He pulled out his phone to call Jim, but the screen showed no signal. Not even emergency calls were possible here. His radio was equally dead, producing only static when he tried to reach dispatch. The logical thing would be to report the underground void to his supervisor and let someone else figure out how to proceed. But the installation contract was worth significant money to Apex Communications, and Marcus knew that coming back empty-handed wouldn't go over well with corporate. He decided to investigate the cavity more thoroughly before making any decisions. Maybe it was just a small cave-in from an old mine shaft. He could fill it with concrete and continue with the tower installation. Marcus rigged a rope around his truck's trailer hitch and lowered a more powerful LED work light into the hole. As the light descended, the void revealed itself to be larger than he'd initially thought. Not just a cavity, but the beginning of a tunnel system that extended horizontally into the surrounding earth. The walls weren't natural cave formation. They were too smooth, too regular, as if something had carved them deliberately. And they were covered in what looked like scratch marks, thousands of parallel lines gouged into the earth and stone. At about 12 feet down, the tunnel branched off in multiple directions. Marcus counted at least 4 separate passages extending beyond the range of his light. The breathing sound had stopped, but now he could hear something else, a faint rustling like dry leaves being moved by wind coming from one of the deeper tunnels. Against every instinct telling him to leave, Marcus decided to climb down for a closer look. He secured his climbing harness and rappelled into the void, his flashlight beam dancing across those strangely carved walls. The temperature was noticeably warmer down here, and the air carried an odd smell, not unpleasant, but organic and unfamiliar, like mushrooms mixed with something sweetly metallic. The bottom of the shaft opened into a roughly circular chamber about 10 feet across. 4 tunnels branched off in different directions, each one disappearing into darkness. The scratch marks were more pronounced here, covering not just the walls, but the floor and ceiling as well. Some were clearly old, worn smooth by time, but others looked fresh, the stone still rough where something had recently clawed through it. Marcus aimed his flashlight down the nearest tunnel. The passage was just wide enough for a person to crawl through comfortably, and it extended beyond the reach of his light. But about 20 feet in his beam caught something that made him freeze. Clothing. Tattered fabric caught on a stone protrusion. Marcus moved closer, his heart pounding. The fabric was modern, looked like part of a work shirt, maybe a uniform. Blue denim material with what might have been a company logo, too damaged to read clearly. As he reached for the fabric, intending to examine it more closely, a sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system. Not breathing this time, but something that sounded disturbingly like whispering, multiple voices speaking in hushed tones too distant to make out words. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by that rustling sound again, but much closer now, and getting closer. Marcus scrambled back toward his rope, suddenly desperate to get out of this underground space. But as he reached for his climbing gear, something grabbed his ankle. He looked down to see a pale hand emerging from one of the other tunnels, fingers wrapped around his boot. The hand was human in shape, but wrong in every other way. Too long, too thin, with joints that bent in directions they shouldn't. The skin was translucent, showing dark veins beneath, and the fingernails were black and unnaturally sharp. Marcus yanked his foot away and heard a hissing sound from the tunnel, followed by rapid movement, something large moving quickly through the narrow space. He clipped onto his rope and began climbing as fast as his equipment would allow, not daring to look down. But halfway up the shaft, Marcus made the mistake of glancing over his shoulder. 3 pale faces were staring up at him from the chamber below. They might have been human once, but time and something else had changed them. Their features were elongated, stretched with large dark eyes that reflected his flashlight beam like an animal's. Their mouths were open, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous, and they were climbing the walls. Not using ropes or equipment, actually climbing fingers and toes, finding purchase in tiny cracks in the stone, moving up the shaft walls with unnatural speed and grace. Marcus hauled himself up the rope faster than he'd ever moved before, his arms burning from the effort. He could hear them below him, no longer bothering to hide their presence, hissing and chittering sounds that might have been communication, accompanied by the scraping of those impossible fingernails against stone. He reached the surface and rolled away from the hole, gasping. But when he looked back, nothing followed him up. The shaft was empty, silent again, as if nothing had happened. Marcus lay on the warm earth for several minutes, trying to process what he'd just experienced. Hallucinations brought on by stress. Carbon monoxide poisoning from his truck. Some kind of toxic gas seeping from the underground cavity, but the tattered fabric was still clutched in his hand, and his ankle bore 4 distinct scratches where those fingers had grabbed him. As he stood and dusted himself off, Marcus noticed something else disturbing. The hole he'd drilled was different now. Where before it had been a rough circle about 8 inches across, it was now perfectly round and noticeably wider, as if something from below had been working to enlarge it. And all around the opening, pressed into the soft earth, were handprints. Dozens of them scattered in a rough circle, as if a crowd of people had been kneeling around the hole. But the prints weren't quite right. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow, and they pressed deeper into the earth than human hands should be able to manage, as if whatever made them, was far heavier than they appeared. Marcus grabbed his equipment and began loading it back into his truck. Whatever was down there, the cell tower installation, was not happening today. He needed to get back to town, contact his supervisor, and figure out what to do next. But as he loaded the last of his gear, Marcus heard something that made him pause. Singing. Faint and distant, but definitely singing, multiple voices, harmonizing in a melody that sounded almost familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby. The song was coming from underground, drifting up through the hole he'd drilled. And despite every rational thought in his head telling him to leave, Marcus found himself drawn toward the sound. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, sad and comforting at the same time. He realized he was walking back toward the hole. The rational part of his mind was screaming warnings, but the song was so lovely, so perfectly pitched. It reminded him of his mother's voice when she'd sung him to sleep as a child, safe and warm and protected. Marcus was at the edge of the opening now, looking down into that impossible darkness. The singing was clearer here, and he could almost make out words, something about coming home, about rest and peace, and ending the long journey. He found himself kneeling beside the hole, leaning forward to hear better. The singing stopped. In the sudden silence, Marcus realized what he was doing and jerked backward. But something was already reaching up from the darkness, not the pale creatures he'd seen before, but something larger, with arms that seemed to stretch impossibly long. Marcus threw himself away from the hole and ran for his truck, not looking back until he was behind the wheel with the engine running. Only then did he glance toward the dead zone. The hole was sealed. The earth was smooth and undisturbed, as if he'd never drilled there at all. Marcus drove away from the dead zone as fast as the rough trail would allow, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. But after only a few minutes, he realized something was wrong. The trail he was following didn't look the same as the one he'd taken in. The trees were different, older, more gnarled, with bark that was almost black. The ruts in the road were deeper, as if carved by much heavier vehicles than his truck. And despite driving for what felt like 20 minutes, he hadn't reached any of the landmarks he remembered from his inbound journey. Marcus stopped the truck and checked his compass. It spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. His GPS remained dead, showing only error messages. Even his watch had stopped, the digital display frozen at 11:47 a.m. He got out of the truck and climbed onto the hood for a better view of the surrounding forest. What he saw made his stomach drop. The dead zone was still visible through the trees maybe half a mile away. Despite driving for nearly half an hour, he'd somehow traveled in a circle. The bare patch of earth and those two dark trees were exactly where they'd been when he left. But that wasn't the worst part. From his elevated position, Marcus could see that the dead zone was larger now. What had been a roughly circular clearing, maybe 100 yards across, was now at least 3 times that size. And it was growing. As he watched, the boundary expanded outward in slow, steady pulses. Each pulse killed the vegetation it touched, not burning or withering, but simply erasing it, leaving behind that same unnaturally smooth earth. And scattered across the newly expanded area, Marcus could see holes. Dozens of them, perfectly round openings in the ground like the one he'd drilled, but larger. From this distance, they looked like dark eyes staring up at the sky. Movement caught his attention. Things were emerging from the holes, pale figures that moved with that same unnatural grace he'd witnessed underground. They spread out across the dead zone in organized groups, as if following some predetermined plan. Marcus jumped down from his truck and grabbed his binoculars from the glove compartment. Through the lenses, the pale figures became clearer, and what he saw made him wish he'd never looked. They were human-shaped, but wrong in every proportion. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Their skin was translucent, showing the dark network of veins beneath. And they were working, not randomly wandering, but engaged in purposeful activity. Some were digging new holes with their bare hands, their clawed fingers tearing through earth and stone as easily as soft clay. Others were arranged in circles around the existing openings, their mouths open as if singing, though Marcus was too far away to hear anything. But the largest group was moving toward the edge of the dead zone, toward the forest where Marcus was hidden. They were hunting. Marcus got back in his truck and tried starting the engine. It turned over sluggishly, coughed, and died. He tried again with the same result. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full and all the warning lights were dark, but the truck refused to start. Through his windshield, Marcus could see the pale figures had reached the tree line. They moved through the forest with predatory efficiency, spreading out to cover more ground, their large dark eyes scanning the shadows. They were maybe 200 yards away and closing fast. Abandoning the truck, Marcus grabbed his emergency backpack and started running deeper into the forest, away from the dead zone and the creatures it had released. But after just a few minutes, he realized he was making a fatal mistake. He was running uphill toward higher ground that would leave him exposed and visible. He changed direction, following what looked like a deer trail down into a narrow valley. The canopy was thicker here, providing better cover, and a small creek offered the possibility of masking his scent. But as Marcus followed the creek downstream, he began to notice disturbing changes in the forest around him. The trees were becoming more like those in the dead zone, bark, darker leaves hanging motionless. The creek water, which had been clear when he first reached it, was now cloudy with sediment that looked almost black. And the silence was returning. The natural forest sounds, birds, insects, rustling leaves, were fading away, replaced by that oppressive quiet he'd experienced in the dead zone. Marcus realized with growing horror That the contamination, or whatever it was, wasn't limited to that original circle of bare earth. It was spreading through the forest like an infection, and he was moving deeper into affected territory with every step. He stopped and looked back the way he'd come. Through the trees, he could see pale figures moving along the ridge above him. They'd found his trail and were following it with methodical precision. But ahead, the creek led to what looked like a small cabin or structure partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. If he could reach it, maybe he could find shelter or tools or some way to contact the outside world. Marcus ran toward the structure, his boots splashing through the increasingly dark water of the creek. Behind him, he could hear the hunting calls of the pale creatures, not quite human voices, but something that carried meaning across the corrupted forest. They were closing in, and the dead zone was still expanding. As Marcus reached the cabin, he realized with dawning terror that this wasn't a rescue, it was a trap. And he was about to discover exactly what had happened to everyone else who'd encountered the dead zones. The cabin was older than Marcus had expected, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to silver gray. But it wasn't abandoned. Smoke rose from the chimney and warm light glowed behind curtained windows. Marcus pounded on the door, gasping from his desperate run through the forest. "Help me! Please! There's something in the woods!" The door opened to reveal an elderly man with kind eyes and calloused hands. "Easy there, son. Come in, come in. You look like you've seen something terrible." Marcus stumbled inside, grateful for the warmth and normalcy of the small cabin. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the smell of coffee filled the air. Everything felt wonderfully, reassuringly ordinary. "Name's William," the old man said, closing the door firmly behind Marcus. "William Thorne. Been living up here for, well, longer than most folks remember. Marcus Chen. I work for Apex Communications. I was installing equipment when..." Marcus stopped, unsure how to explain what he'd witnessed without sounding insane. William nodded knowingly. "You found one of the holes, didn't you? Drilled right into something you weren't supposed to disturb." Marcus stared at him. "You know about them, the things underground." "Oh, I know about a lot of things up here," William said, pouring Marcus a cup of coffee. "These mountains are old, son. Older than the mining companies ever realized. There are places where the earth is thin, where things that should stay buried sometimes push their way up to the surface." The coffee was perfect, hot and strong, and completely normal. Marcus felt some of his panic subsiding as he sat by the fire, watching the flames dance against the stone hearth. "The company sent me to install a cell tower right in the middle of what locals call a dead zone," Marcus explained. "When I drilled the foundation hole, I broke through into some kind of tunnel system. There were things down there, William. Things that looked almost human, but weren't." William sat across from him, his expression grave. The old-timers had different names for them. Some called them the Hollow Folk. Others just called them the Underneath People. They've been down there for a very long time, sleeping mostly. But when someone disturbs their rest, they wake up, Marcus finished. "They wake up," William confirmed. "And they remember how hungry they've been." Marcus set down his coffee cup, feeling calmer than he had since leaving the dead zone. The cabin felt safe, protected somehow. "What do we do? How do we stop them?" William smiled, and for the first time Marcus noticed something odd about the old man's teeth. They were too sharp, and when William blinked, his eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Oh, son," William said softly, "you don't stop them, you join them." The cabin began to change around Marcus, the warm logs and cheerful fire, revealing themselves to be something else entirely. Pale stone walls and cold phosphorescent light. Marcus tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey him. The coffee cup slipped from numb fingers, shattering on what was no longer a wooden floor, but smooth carved stone. The comfortable cabin dissolved around him like a fading dream, revealing the truth of where he really was. He was underground, sitting in a circular chamber identical to the one he'd discovered beneath the dead zone. But this one was larger, older, with dozens of tunnels branching off in all directions. The walls were covered in those same scratch marks, layer upon layer of them, as if countless hands had clawed at the stone over decades. William, or the thing that had appeared as William, watched Marcus with patient, ancient eyes. Its true form was tall and elongated with that same translucent skin Marcus had seen on the creatures in the tunnels. But this one was different, older, wearing the remnants of clothing that might have been from another era entirely. The coffee was real, it said in a voice like rustling leaves. We've learned to make real things when we need to. It helps with the transition. Marcus tried to speak, but could only make a choking sound. Whatever had been in the coffee was paralyzing his vocal cords along with his muscles. You're probably wondering how long you've actually been down here, the creature continued conversationally. Time works differently in the deep places. What felt like minutes to you has been considerably longer up above. Through the tunnels, Marcus could hear movement, dozens of creatures moving through the underground network with purpose, and singing. That same hauntingly beautiful melody he'd heard before, but now he could make out the words, come down to the deep places. Leave behind the burning sky, come home to the darkness where the old things never die. The dead zones aren't random, William explained, settling beside Marcus with inhuman grace. They're doorways, places where the boundary between above and below has worn thin. Your people have been drilling holes all over these mountains for decades, mining fracking telecommunications infrastructure. Each hole gives us a little more access to the surface world. Marcus managed to turn his head slightly, fighting against the paralysis. In the phosphorescent light, he could see that the chamber was occupied by dozens of figures, all watching him with those large reflective eyes. Some still showed traces of their human origins, fragments of clothing, hair color, facial features. Others had been changed beyond recognition. The transformation isn't painful, William assured him. In fact, most find it quite peaceful. The hunger fades, the fear disappears, and the singing. Oh, Marcus, wait until you hear how beautiful your own voice becomes. The creature reached out with one impossibly long finger and touched Marcus's forehead. Images flooded his mind, not his own memories, but William's. Marcus saw the truth of what had happened here. William had been a mining surveyor in 1962 when he discovered the first tunnel system. Like Marcus, he'd investigated alone. Like Marcus, he'd been welcomed by something that seemed helpful and human. The transformation had taken 3 days. The others had similar stories spanning decades. Hunters who disappeared in the mountains, hikers who'd never returned from their trails, repair crews who'd vanished while working on remote infrastructure. Each one had found their way to a dead zone, had been drawn underground, had made the same choice Marcus was about to make. The cell tower installation was completed successfully, by the way, William mentioned casually. You did excellent work. The signal reaches much farther now than your employers ever expected. We've been using it to coordinate expansion across the entire mountain region. Marcus felt his consciousness beginning to fade as the paralysis spread to his brain. But just before the darkness took him, he heard William's final words. Welcome to the deep places, Marcus. When you wake up, you'll understand everything, and you'll help us reach the others. The singing grew louder, more voices joining the ancient melody, and somewhere far above in the world of sunlight and normal things, another telecommunications worker was receiving work orders for dead zone installations. The expansion was accelerating.